The wind in Carbon, Wyoming, had a noise like screaming. It was late October, 1878, and the wind carried the first promise of a winter that would kill anything left unprotected. Clara Reed stood unprotected. She was outside the dry goods store, a place where she had rented a small room above the sacks of flour and barrels of nails for the past year. Her belongings were in a single carpet bag at her feet. She had been a widow for 2 years, a seamstress by trade, and now she was a pariah. The women of the town, led by Mrs. Agatha Finch, the banker's wife, stood across the muddy street. They were wrapped in thick wool, their faces pinched by the cold and by righteousness. A decent town cannot abide this, Mrs. Finch had declared an hour earlier, standing in the cramped hallway outside Clara's room. The sheriff, a man named Hatcher who wore his badge like an apology, had stood behind her, unable to meet Clara's eyes. The accusation was filth, but it was vague. A drifter, a man with no name who mattered, had been found hanging from a cottonwood by the creek 2 days prior. He had been lynched for stealing a horse, but the rumors that bloomed in the aftermath had tangled themselves around Clara. He had been seen leaving her shop late. He had been drunk. She had, the women whispered, entertained him. Clara had done no such thing. The man had come to her shop, smelling of rye whiskey and desperation, demanding she mend his coat for free. When she refused, he had grabbed her. She had struck him with a hot flat iron, and he had fled, cursing her. She never saw him again until she saw him hanging. But the women of Carbon, trapped in a town of coal dust and hard men, needed a sinner. Clara, quiet, childless, and bound to no man, was the perfect choice. "I did nothing," she had said, her voice low. Harlots always claim innocence. Mrs. Finch snapped. "Sheriff, see her out. We will not have her kind bringing God's judgment down on us, not with winter coming." Sheriff Hatcher had cleared his throat. "Mrs. Reed, the town council feels it's best if you move on. We don't want trouble. Where am I to go?" "That ain't the town's concern." The worst of it was the theft. She was owed $12 by the mercantile for a shipment of mended blankets and 3 new canvas coats for the miners. The owner, siding with his best customers, refused to pay. "Consider it forfeit," he said, pushing her bag onto the boardwalk. Now, she stood alone. The wind tore at the thin shawl around her shoulders. She had $7 to her name, saved from her work for the railroad men. It was not enough for a train ticket east, and she would not go west. There was nothing west but more of the same. She went to the livery. The stable master, a man named Silas, sold her a half-lame mule and a rickety cart for $6. It was robbery, and they both knew it. "Where you headed, ma'am?" he asked, not unkindly. "North." She said. The railroad ran east and west. The town controlled the south. North was just the foothills, the high empty country, and the promise of snow. North was nowhere. She slapped the reins, and the mule moved with a pained reluctance. As the cart cleared the last shanty on the edge of town, the first flakes of snow began to spin in the air, hard and dry as salt. She traveled for 2 days. The world shrank to the gray back of the mule, the creak of the wooden wheels, and the relentless, screaming wind. The snow was not deep yet, but it was constant. It built dunes against the sagebrush and obscured the horizon. The foothills rose around her, rocky and barren, offering no shelter. Clara had not eaten in a day. The cold had settled deep in her bones, a dull ache that seemed to start in her teeth. She thought of her late husband, Thomas. He had been a gentleman, a man who read poetry and coughed his lungs out into a bloody handkerchief. He had been kind, but he had not prepared her for this. He had not been strong enough to survive the damp of Illinois, and she wondered if she was strong enough to survive the dry cold of Wyoming. On the 3rd morning, the mule stopped. It stood with its head lowered, flanks shuddering. The snow was knee-deep on the animal, drifted higher against the cart. Clara climbed down, her legs numb and clumsy. She fell to her hands and knees in the snow. "Get up," she whispered to the mule. "Please, get up." She pushed at its hindquarters. The animal did not budge. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through her exhaustion. She was miles from anywhere, in a white, soundless world. She looked north and saw nothing but endless white and the dark skeletons of pine trees far up the slope. She tried to walk, to lead the animal. She took 10 steps, and the wind hit her. It knocked the breath from her lungs and spun her around. She fell again. This time, the snow felt soft. It felt like a blanket. It would be so easy, she thought, to just close her eyes, to let the quiet take her. Thomas was quiet now. She could be quiet, too. She lost track of time. The gray light of the sky seemed to be fading. She was so very cold. She tried to pull her carpet bag closer, but her arms would not obey. She laid her head down on the snow, and the world went dark. Eli McRae found her because he was checking his northern fence line. The storm was setting in, the kind of blizzard that could bury a steer in an hour, and he needed to make sure his small herd was pushed down into the canyon. He saw the mule first, a dark hump that should not have been there. He rode closer, his horse, a big roan gelding, snorting at the smell of the half-dead mule. Then he saw her, a smaller drift of calico and wool half buried beside the cart. Eli swore. The word ripped away by the wind. He dismounted, and the landing was a jolt. His left leg, the one made of carved hickory and leather straps, punched through the crust of snow. The stump above it, where his real leg had ended just below the knee, sent a sharp, agonizing signal of cold up his thigh. He ignored it. He had ignored it for 5 years. He limped over to the woman, his gait a heavy thump drag in the snow. He nudged her with his boot. No movement. He assumed she was dead, another fool who thought they could beat the prairie. He knelt, his good knee sinking, and rolled her over. A cloud of fine snow fell away from her face. It was pale, blue-white, her lips cracked and dark. But as he watched, a small, frosted breath escaped those lips. Alive! His first instinct was to leave her. It was a cold, hard knot in his gut. A woman. Women were trouble. Women were liars. Women were the reason his ranch was a ruin, his son was a memory, and his leg was a piece of wood. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the night the raiders came. He thought of the smell of smoke and whiskey, and Sarah's laugh, high and shrill, as she fled with them. She had been the one to let them in. She had been the one who helped them set the fire that took his boy, Jacob, and burned his leg so bad it had to be cut. This woman in the snow was probably just like her, scheming, running from something, or running towards something she meant to steal. But the wind was a wall of ice. Even he could barely stand in it. To leave her was to murder her. "Damnation," he muttered. He was not a strong man, not anymore. The fire had taken much of his muscle, along with his trust. But she was light, almost nothing. He lifted her, a dead weight of wet cloth, and managed to heave her over the saddle of his roan. She slumped there like a sack of feed. He looked at the mule. It was an animal. He couldn't leave it either. With a heavy sigh, he unhitched the near-frozen creature from the cart, leaving the useless wagon to be buried. He tied the mule's rope to his saddle horn, grabbed his horse's bridle, and began the slow, agonizing walk back to his cabin, dragging his wooden leg through the deepening snow. Clara woke to darkness. The first sensation was warmth. It was a deep, prickling heat, painful as it seeped back into her hands and feet. The second was the smell, wood smoke, old coffee, and something musky, like cured hides and dust. She was lying on a cot, covered by a heavy, scratchy wool blanket and a buffalo hide. A fire crackled somewhere to her left, casting a dull, flickering orange light onto a low ceiling of rough-hewn logs. She sat up too quickly. The room spun, and a wave of sickness washed over her. She was weak, weaker than she had cost of living ever felt. "Stay down," a voice said. The voice was low and rough, like gravel rattling in a pan. She looked toward the fire. A man sat in a chair, silhouetted against the flames. He was large, or seemed so in the shadows. He was cleaning a rifle, the metallic snick-snick of the oiled rag echoing in the small cabin. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The fear was immediate, visceral. She was alone, in a strange cabin, with a man she did not know. The memory of the drifter in her shop, his whiskey breath on her face, flooded back. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. "My property," he said. He did not look up from the rifle. "Found you in the snow. You were near gone." "My mule." "In the lean-to, alive, for now." She tried to swing her legs over the side of the cot, but they tangled in the heavy blankets. She saw her dress, frozen stiff, hanging from a peg near the fire. She was in her underthings, her chemise and drawers, still damp but warming. A wave of shame and fear made her pull the buffalo hide up to her chin. "Did you—" "I didn't bother," he said, still not looking at lethargy. "You were half ice. Had to get the wet clothes off or you'd lose your feet." He gestured with his head. "There's broth on the hearth." She saw a small pot sitting on the stones. He was not looking at her. He seemed entirely focused on the rifle. Slowly, she reached for the pot, her hands shaking. It was tin, and the broth inside was thin, tasting mostly of salt and bacon grease. But it was the hottest, most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. She drank it in gulps. "I have no money," she said, when the pot was empty. In town, they took my pay." The man stopped polishing the rifle. He set it down carefully, assembled it with practiced, economical movements, and finally turned his head. She could see his face clearly for the first time. It was a hard face, carved by sun and wind, and marked by something bitter. He looked to be about 40. His eyes were dark and assessing. "I ain't running a charity," he said. "I can work," she said, the words rushing out. "I'm a seamstress. I can mend your clothes. I can clean. I can cook. I cook well. I can earn my keep, just for the winter. Just until the storm breaks and I can go." He stood up, and she saw it. He moved with a limp, a heavy, unbalanced gait. He walked from the shadows into the firelight, and she saw that his left leg, from the knee down, was a piece of dark wood, strapped to his thigh with thick leather. He was Eli McRae. She had heard the name in town, the hermit, the cripple, the man who had lost his family in a fire and hadn't been seen in Carbon in over a year. He stopped a few feet from her cot, watching her. His gaze was so cold, so suspicious. It was worse than the wind. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a wolf caught in a trap, wondering if it's rabid. "A seamstress," he said, his voice flat. "Yes, and I can cook and clean your clothes." She gestured to the pile of canvas and wool in the corner. "They need mending. I can make them hold against the wind. I can darn your socks. I can make bread." Eli looked around his cabin. It was a single room, filthy with dust, old food, and the detritus of a man living alone. He looked at his stack of clothes, torn from catching on barbed wire and brush. He looked at his own hands, calloused and clumsy. He hated sewing. He hated cooking. He hated cleaning. But he hated this woman more. He hated the way she looked at him, with that fear in her eyes. He hated that she was here, breathing his air, forcing him to make a choice. Winter, however, was a hard partner. The blizzard was just the start. There would be months of it, months of hauling feed, breaking ice, and fighting the drifts. He couldn't do it alone, not with his leg. The pain was already setting in, the cold finding the old scars. "You cook," he said, his voice a low growl. "You clean. You mend what's broken. You will not speak unless spoken to, and you will stay out of my sight as much as a body can in one room." He pointed to her cot. "That's your space. You don't cross to this side." He indicated his own bed, a larger, rough-built frame on the other side of the hearth. "Thank you," she whispered, relief making her dizzy. "I ain't doing it for you," he snapped. "I need the help. Come spring, you're gone." "Yes, of course." He picked up his rifle, checked the load, and put on a heavy buffalo coat. "There's beans in the sack and salt pork in the barrel. There's a spring out back, under the pines. Keep the bucket full. I'm checking the cattle." He opened the door. A wall of white, howling wind met him. He leaned into it, his wooden leg thumping on the porch boards, and vanished into the storm. Clara was left alone in the silence, with only the sound of the fire and the wind pressing against the logs. The cabin was old. The wind found every chink in the daubing, sending tiny drafts of snow onto the floor. It was a cold, quiet life. Eli McRae was a man of profound, heavy silence. He would leave before dawn, his thump-drag gait announcing his departure, and would not return until after dusk. He would enter, caked in snow, his beard frosted. He would shed his coat, his face grim with exhaustion and pain. Clara would have stew ready. He would take the bowl from her, his fingers brushing hers, and his hand felt rough as bark. He would eat by the fire, his back to her. He would clean his leg, unstrapping the wooden prosthetic to rub the scarred stump. And he did it without modesty, as if she were not there at all. Then he would roll into his bunk and sleep. Clara worked. She worked with a quiet, desperate energy. She was earning her life, minute by minute. She scrubbed the floor with a stiff brush she found. She washed his clothes, his flannel shirts, his heavy canvas pants, her hands cracking and bleeding in the lye soap and cold water. She found his sewing kit, thick needles, waxed thread, and began to repair. She patched his trousers with scraps of canvas. She darned his socks, her stitches small and neat. She relined his coat collar with a piece of her own flannel petticoat, making it softer against his neck. She cooked. She learned the measure of the cabin, how much wood to burn, how much salt pork to use. She organized the shelves, stacking the tins of coffee and baking soda. She found mice nests and cleared them out. She was trying to erase her own presence by making the cabin better, cleaner. She made herself useful so that she might be invisible. But he watched her. She would be kneading dough, and she would feel his eyes on her back. He sat by the fire, oiling the leather straps of his prosthetic, and his gaze was constant, cold, and suspicious. He was waiting. He was waiting for the scheme, the lie, the moment she would ask for money, or whiskey, or protection. He was waiting for her to reveal the rot he believed was inside every woman. Clara revealed nothing. She cooked, she cleaned, she sewed, and she kept to her side of the room. The silence was the hardest part. In town, there had been noise, the sound of the miners, the saloon piano, the gossip of the women. Here, there was only the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the heavy, accusing silence of Eli McRae. In the bottom of her carpet bag, she had a small, cloth-bound journal and a pencil stub. When Eli was gone, or when he was deep asleep, she wrote. She did not write about the cold, or the fear. She wrote letters she would never, could never, send. She wrote to her husband, Thomas. "You left me, Thomas. You were a good man, a gentle man, but you were not strong. You left me to this world, and I am not gentle. I am cold. I am afraid. I wish you were here, but I am glad you are not. You would not have survived the street in Carbon. You would not have survived this cabin. Sometimes I hate you for dying." She wrote to Mrs. Agatha Finch. "He was a drunkard, Mrs. Finch. He came to my room. He put his hands on me. I hit him with the iron. I did not scream because I knew no one would help. I knew they would blame me, And they did. You lynched him for a horse, but you evicted me for a lie you wanted to believe. I hope your winter is as cold as my heart. She wrote to her mother, who had died 10 years ago. I am in a cabin with a man who hates me, but he gave me shelter. I am warm. I am eating. I am mending his clothes. It is a strange penance. I am safe from the town, but I am not safe. I do not think I will ever be safe again. I do not know what I have done to deserve this life, but I am living it. I am still living. She would read the letters over, her throat tight, and then she would hide the journal under the thin, straw-ticked mattress on her cot. They were the only true things she owned. November settled on the ranch like a shroud. The world was reduced to 2 colors, the white of the snow that buried the sagebrush, and the flat, gray iron of the sky. The silence inside the cabin was as deep as the snow outside, broken only by the snap of the fire or the scrape of a spoon against a wooden bowl. Clara and Eli circled each other in this small, smoky space. 2 planets held in a tight, unwilling orbit. They did not speak of the storm, or the town, or the future. They spoke of necessity. The water bucket is low. I need that shirt mended. The wind is shifting north. But a new language was growing between them, built of small, silent actions. Clara learned the sound of his limp. She knew when the damp air was biting at the scarred stump of his leg. His thump drag would become heavier, the drag more pronounced, his face tighter. On those mornings, she made the coffee stronger and left a tin of the salve she had made from pine resin and lard on the table, near his hand. He never acknowledged it, but he always used it. She cooked with a quiet fury, channeling her fear and her isolation into the food. She baked bread that was dense and dark, but nourishing. She stretched the salt pork and beans into stews that were hot and filling when he came in from the cold, his beard glittering with ice. She was, by her actions, proving her worth. I am not a burden. I am useful. Eli, in turn, observed. He watched her hands, red and cracked from the lye soap and the icy water. As she stitched his canvas coat, her stitches were impossibly small, a precise, tight line that would hold against any wind. She was not just mending. She was armor-plating him against the winter. Clara had a small, rickety table she used for her sewing, salvaged from a corner. One of its legs was split, and it wobbled every time she cut cloth. It drove her mad, but she said nothing. One afternoon, she returned from fetching water from the spring, a brutal task that involved chipping through a skin of ice to find the table fixed. Eli had braced the leg with a new piece of carved pine and secured it with a strip of cured leather. It was solid as a rock. He was sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle, his back to her, as if he had done nothing at all. Clara looked at the table, at the neat wrap of the leather. She looked at his broad back. She opened her mouth to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. Thank you was a coin of the town, a piece of polite society. It had no currency here. She simply sat down at the table, threaded her needle, and began to sew. The table did not wobble. The last week of November, the real blizzard came. It did not arrive gently. It struck the cabin like a physical blow. The wind changed from a scream to a solid, roaring wall of sound that shook the very logs. Snow did not fall. It moved horizontally, a white torrent that erased the world. For 3 days, they were prisoners. The cabin grew dark as snow piled up against the small, greased paper windows. The wind was so loud they had to shout to be heard, but they did not shout. They simply existed, the tension in the room thickening with every hour. On the 2nd day, Eli knew he had to check the livestock. The mule and his roan were in the lean-to, along with the 2 milk cows, but the small herd of cattle was in the canyon. If they drifted, they would freeze. Stay inside, he ordered, pulling on his heavy buffalo coat. Don't open the door till I get back. He stepped out and was swallowed. Clara watched through a crack in the door as he vanished into a solid, churning wall of white. He was gone for 2 hours. Clara paced the small floor, from her cot to the hearth, her heart a cold knot of dread. If he fell, if his leg gave way, he would be buried in minutes. She would be alone. She would not last the winter. It was a selfish fear, but it was honest. The door burst open, letting in a cyclone of snow and a blast of Arctic air. Eli fell through it. More than walked. He was a creature of ice. His hat, his coat, his beard, all were frozen solid. He managed to heave the door shut against the wind and collapsed against it, breathing in great, ragged gasps. "The cattle," she started. "They're in the shelter rock," he gasped. "They'll hold." He limped toward the fire, shedding his icy coat. As he unwrapped the scarf from his face, she saw his skin was pale, almost gray. He sat heavily on his stool. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He reached down to unstrap his wooden leg. The leather was frozen stiff. He swore, his voice low and vicious, fumbling with the buckles. When he finally pulled the heavy prosthetic free, Clara drew in a sharp breath. The stump, usually just scarred, was raw and bleeding. The friction of his desperate walk, combined with the brutal cold, had rubbed the skin away. Blood oozed from the old scar tissue, bright red against the pale skin. Eli saw her looking. "Get your eyes off it," he snarled, grabbing a dirty rag from the floor to cover himself. "It's bleeding," she said, ignoring the order. "I'm aware." He tried to wipe it and hissed in pain. Clara's fear vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. This was something she understood. This was mending. She went to her carpet bag and pulled out a roll of clean linen, one of her last good chemises, torn into strips. She grabbed the pot of warm water from the hearth and the tin of salve. "Don't you touch me," he warned, his voice a low growl, as she knelt in front of him. Clara looked up, meeting his furious gaze. "I've seen worse. Mr. McRae. And if that gets infected, you won't be walking at all. Now hold still." Her voice, calm and certain, cut through his anger. He stared at her, his chest heaving, but he did not move. Her touch was not gentle, but it was professional. It was the touch of a seamstress, practical and efficient. She cleaned the wound, her fingers moving quickly, wiping away the blood and grime. He winced, his whole body rigid, but he let her work. She applied the salve, and he grunted as it stung the raw skin. Then she took the linen strips and began to wrap the stump. She wrapped it firmly, her motions practiced, creating a clean padded layer to protect him. It was the first time she had touched him. She was kneeling at his feet, her hands on his mutilated leg. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the tremor of pain that ran through him. She saw the network of old scars, the puckered flesh where the fire had taken him. For the first time, she did not see a monster or a hermit. She saw a man in terrible, constant pain. When she was finished, she tied the knot and sat back on her heels. "That should hold," she said quietly. Eli looked down at the clean white bandage. He did not look at her. He seemed frozen, his hands clenched on his good knee. The silence in the cabin was suddenly louder than the storm outside. He cleared his throat. "It'll do." He picked up his wooden leg and began strapping it on over her bandage. The blizzard raged for another day, but something inside the cabin had broken. The ice was still there, but a small crack had formed. When the storm finally passed, it left a new world, silent and suffocating under a 6-foot blanket of snow. The silence returned to the cabin, but it was strained. Eli was gruff, almost hostile, as if embarrassed by the intimacy she had forced upon him. He avoided her, spending his days digging out the lean-to, his thump drag a furious, relentless sound in the snow. Clara went about her chores. The cabin felt small, charged with his resentment. She began a deep cleaning, needing to scrub away the tension. She was dusting the rough sawn mantelpiece, wiping away layers of soot and ash. Her fingers brushed against a small, warped tin frame, half buried in the grime. She picked it up. The glass was cracked and fogged with soot. Wiping it, she could just make out the image beneath, a smiling woman with dark, piled-up hair, and a small boy on her lap. "Put that down." His voice was not loud. It was a low, lethal command. Clara started, and the frame slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hearthstone. Eli stood in the open doorway, his face a mask of such cold fury that she stepped back, her hand flying to her throat. "I said," he repeated, walking into the room, his limp heavy. "Put it down." I was just cleaning," she stammered. "I didn't mean—" "That ain't your business," he roared, the sudden volume making her flinch. He snatched the frame from the hearth, his hand closing around it. "Nothing here is your business. You're here to work, not to root through my things." "I wasn't rooting." "Liar," he spat. "Just like her, always touching things that don't belong to you, always prying." He was breathing hard, his eyes dark with a pain that was years old. He looked at the picture, then back at her, his gaze filled with a bottomless, burning hatred. "Get out of my sight," he whispered. "Go to your cot." Shaking, Clara retreated. She sat on the edge of her bed, her back to him, her hands clenched in her lap. She heard him shove the picture frame back onto the mantel, the sound rough and final. Then she heard the door slam. She did not move for an hour. The injustice of it stung worse than the cold. She had done nothing but try to clean his filth, and he had looked at her as if she were a thief. She stayed on her cot for the rest of the day. She did not light the lamp when darkness fell. She would not cook for him. She would not mend for him. She lay under her blanket, rigid with cold and anger. She heard him return late, the thump drag hesitant on the porch. He entered the dark cabin. She heard him sigh, a long, rough sound. He lit the lamp himself, the sudden light making her squeeze her eyes shut. He moved around, stoked the fire. She could smell coffee. He did not speak to her. She did not turn around. An hour passed. The cabin was warm. The smell of rabbit stew slowly filled the air. He was cooking. She heard him eat. Then his heavy footsteps approached. He stopped just short of her cot, on his side of the room. She heard a soft thunk as he set a bowl on the floor. "Eat," he said, his voice a low rumble. He walked back to the fire. Clara waited. The smell of the stew was agonizing. She was starving. After a long time, she slowly reached out, her hand finding the warm bowl in the dark. It was a gruff, silent apology, and a command. The wood ran out. The great pile of seasoned logs he had stacked by the door was gone, consumed by the blizzard. All that remained was a pile of uncut rounds, half frozen and too thick for the stove. Eli went out in the flat, gray morning light, his heavy splitting maul in hand. Clara watched him from the window. He was slow. He would place a round on the block, balance on his good leg, and swing. Thump. The maul would bite, but not split. He would have to wrench it free, panting, and swing again. His wooden leg was a liability, offering no purchase in the snow. He was breathing hard, frustration rolling off him in waves. He was only one man, and he was half a man at that. Clara looked at the empty wood box. She looked at the cold stove. She made a decision. She pulled on her own thin coat, then pulled Eli's old, discarded canvas coat on over it. She wrapped her shawl around her head and pushed her feet into the oversized, worn-out boots he had given her. She walked outside. The cold hit her face. Eli stopped, his maul resting on the block, and watched her. His face was dark, ready to snarl at her for interfering. Clara ignored him. She walked past him to the lean-to and picked up the smaller axe, the one used for kindling and limbing. It was still heavy in her hands. She walked back to the woodpile, selected a smaller, split piece, and began to chop it into kindling. Her swings were awkward, weak, but she did not stop. Eli watched her for a full minute, his breath smoking in the air. He saw the determination, the way her lips were pressed into a thin, pale line. She was not offering help. She was simply doing the work that needed to be done. He grunted, turned back to the block, and lifted his maul. "Stand clear," he said. He swung, a powerful, focused blow. The log split clean. Crack! Clara immediately bent down, grabbed the two halves, and moved them to the growing stack. She placed another round on the block for him. He swung. Crack! She cleared. They found a rhythm. He was the strength, the one great force that broke the wood. She was the speed, the one who fed the block and stacked the results. Thump! Crack! Her breath. His grunt. Thump! Crack! They worked for 2 hours without a word. The sun was a pale wafer in the sky. Sweat froze on Eli's forehead. Clara's arms ached with a fire she had never known, but the woodpile grew. They were a team, 2 parts of the same machine, driven by the cold. When they were finished, a stack of wood large enough for a week stood by the door. They were both breathing hard, exhausted. Eli leaned on his maul, looking at the wood, then at her. She was covered in snow and sawdust. Her face flushed red from the cold and the work. "Go inside," he said. "You're freezing." It was the first time his voice had held no anger, just a flat statement of fact. That night, the cabin felt different. The shared labor had warmed it more than the fire. Eli was quiet, but it was a tired quiet, not an angry one. He was smoking his pipe by the fire, his leg propped up. The smell of the tobacco was rich and comforting. Clara sat on her cot, mending her own dress, the needle flashing in the firelight. The silence stretched, but it was no longer a weapon. She looked at her hands, which were blistered from the axe handle. She thought of the town, of Mrs. Finch's pinched face. She thought of the photograph on the mantel. "Mr. McRae," she said. Her voice was small, and she had to clear her throat and start again. "Mr. McRae." He made a low sound, indicating he was listening. She kept her eyes on her sewing, unable to look at him. "Those women in town, they said I was wicked, that I was a fallen woman." She paused. He did not move. "You've seen me here for a month. You see how I work." She finally looked up, her gaze meeting his in the dim light. "Do you think I am? Do you think I'm a wicked woman?" The question hung in the smoky air. Eli stopped rocking his chair. He took the pipe from his mouth and stared into the flames. Clara could see the muscles in his jaw working as he chewed on the question. He was a man who believed in clear lines, sinners and saints. His wife had been a sinner. He had decided Clara was, too. Now, he looked at the wood she had stacked. He looked at the clean bandage on his leg. He looked at his mended coat. He had no answer. The world was no longer simple. This woman, who worked like a man, who was quiet and clean, who had not asked him for a single thing, did not fit the picture of the harlot he had built in his mind. But to admit she was not wicked was to admit the town was wrong. It was to admit that his judgment, the judgment he had built his entire lonely life upon, was flawed. He could not do it. He knocked the ash from his pipe against the hearth, the sound loud and abrupt. He stood, his limp heavy. "Time to sleep," he said, and turned his back to her, moving to his own bunk. He had not answered. His refusal was an answer in itself. It left a cold space between them. A few days later, they sat at the small table for supper. It was a rare occasion. Usually, he ate by the fire and she on her cot, but she had made a stew from a tough old rabbit, and it needed to be eaten hot. They ate in silence. The scrape of their spoons, the only sound. The stew was hot. At least, Clara felt the need to fill the void his non-answer had left. "I am grateful," she said, her eyes on her bowl. "For the food, for not turning me out when you found me." Eli kept eating. He finished his bowl, pushing it away. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the lamplight. "I needed a hand for the winter," he said, his voice flat. "The cattle don't feed themselves. My leg ain't what it was." He leaned forward slightly. "Didn't mean I trust you yet." The words were a cold, hard slap. She was a tool, a pair of hands. She was useful, not welcome. "I understand," she whispered, looking back down at her stew. The truce was broken. The cabin was small, and privacy was a luxury neither could afford. They had a careful routine. He rose first, dressing in the pre-dawn dark, and would be gone to the barn before she lit the lamp. She would wait until she heard the sound of his axe or the lowing of the cattle before she rose and dressed herself, cherishing the few moments of solitude. One morning, the routine failed. A buckle on the strap of his wooden leg had snapped in the intense cold. He came back to the cabin, stamping the snow from his boots, expecting her to be asleep. He pushed the warped door open and stopped dead. Clara was by her cot, standing in the pale, gray light from the window. She was in her chemise, her back to him. She was washing herself from a basin of lukewarm water, a thin cloth in her hand. He saw the sharp line of her spine, the pale, vulnerable skin of her shoulders. She was thinner than he imagined, almost frail. Her dark hair was unpinned, falling in a heavy wave past her waist. As he watched, she leaned forward, and the chemise pulled tight, outlining the curve of her hip. A jolt went through him, a sudden, unfamiliar heat that tightened his gut. It was a feeling he had not had in 5 years, a feeling he associated with betrayal and pain. She must have sensed him, she gasped, spinning around, her hands flying up to cover her chest. Her eyes were wide, her face flushing with shame. Eli's own face burned. He looked away instantly, his gaze fixed on the door latch. "The strap," he muttered, turning his back to her, his voice rough. "Busted." He stood on the porch, his back to the open door, pretending to inspect the broken buckle, but the image of her was burned into his mind. The white skin, the dark hair. He was angry. He was angry at her for being there, for being a woman, and he was furious with himself. Because after he had looked away, his eyes had been drawn back, just for a second, before he turned. He had looked again. The cabin became a tinderbox. The air was thick with what was unsaid, with the image of her that now lived in his mind. They avoided each other's eyes. Every accidental brush of hands as she passed him a plate was a shock. The tension built for 2 days, a low, simmering pressure. It broke over something small. He was in a foul mood. The damp air was agony on his leg, and the whiskey bottle he kept under his bunk was half empty. He was hunting for a whetstone, rooting through a small crate of tools. His hand hit something soft. He pulled it out. It was her journal, the one bound in cloth. He had seen her writing in it. "What's this?" he demanded, standing up. He held it out, his suspicion plain. "What secrets you writing? Lies?" Clara, who was kneading bread, spun around, her hands white with flour. "That is mine," she said, her voice sharp. She moved toward him, reaching for it. He held it up, out of her reach. "A woman with secrets is a woman with lies," he snarled, the whiskey making his voice thick. "That's what my wife was, full of secrets, full of lies." "Give it to me, Mr. McRae." "What's in it? Seamstress. What really happened in Carbon? You entice him, that drifter. Did you promise him something to get his money? Is that what you did?" The accusation, so close to the poison the town had spat at her, so close to the betrayal he had suffered, broke her. The last of her restraint snapped. "No!" she shouted, her voice cracking, echoing in the small room. She lunged and snatched the book from his hand, clutching it to her chest. "No! He came to me. He smelled of a saloon, and he put his hands on me. He pushed me against the wall, and he said a widow needed a man. He said he would be the man." Eli stopped, his anger faltering. The raw truth in her voice was undeniable. "I hit him," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by tears of rage and shame. They streamed down her flour-dusted cheeks. "I hit him with the hot iron. He ran, cursing me. And the next day, they found him hanging for a horse. And Mrs. Finch, she said I tempted him. She said I was a harlot. They threw me out with no pay. No, nothing. They blamed me. They always blame the woman." She was sobbing now, deep, shuddering cries that tore at her. She stumbled back to her cot and collapsed, curling into a ball, the small journal clutched to her chest. The cabin was filled with the sound of her grief. Eli stood frozen, the whiskey bottle still in his hand. He said nothing. His face was stone. He looked at this shaking woman, and he saw, for the first time, not his wife, not a liar, but something else. He saw the truth. He saw an injustice that mirrored his own. The world had burned her, just as it had burned him. He turned slowly and walked back to the hearth. He sat on his stool for a long, long time, staring into the fire, listening to her cry. The sound was raw, and it clawed at something deep inside him, something he thought was long dead. Guilt. He looked at the bottle in his hand. He pulled the cork with his teeth. He stood, his limp loud in the sudden quiet as her sobs subsided into shudders. He walked across the room, crossing the invisible line he had drawn. Clara flinched, looking up as his shadow fell over her. Her face was swollen, streaked with tears and flour. Eli McRae said nothing. He did not apologize. He did not touch her. He simply held out the bottle of whiskey. The bottle, when he offered it, was a truce. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was calloused and hard as rock. She did not drink. She simply held the warm glass, the smell of the corn liquor sharp in the cold air, and looked at him. His face was a map of old grief, and for the first time, she saw her own reflection in it. She corked the bottle and set it on the floor. "Get some sleep, Mr. McRae," she said, her voice quiet. She pulled her thin blanket from the cot and, before he could protest, draped it over his shoulders. Then she retreated to her own side of the room, leaving him by the fire in the darkness. He did not go to his bed. He sat there, wrapped in her blanket, and watched the fire burn down to embers. A week passed. The shared whiskey and her raw confession had changed the air. The silence was still present, but it was no longer a weapon. It was a shared space, a valley they both inhabited. He still did not speak of his past, and she did not speak of hers. But when he passed her the coffee pot in the morning, his eyes met hers. Just for a moment, and the suspicion in them was gone, replaced by something she could not name, a weariness, a recognition. The thaw came in mid-January, a false spring. The snow on the roof melted, dripping a steady, maddening rhythm onto the porch. The world turned to mud, and with the mud came a rider. Clara saw him first, a dark shape moving slowly through the gray slush of the canyon. Her heart seized. No one came to this ranch. She stepped back from the window. "Eli," she said. She did not use his title. It was the first time she had said his given name. He was at the hearth, cleaning his rifle, always cleaning his rifle. He looked up, his body tensing. He had heard the hoofbeats. He stood, his good leg taking his weight, and limped to the door, grabbing his shotgun from the pegs beside it. "Stay back," he said. He stepped onto the porch. Clara watched from the dirty window. The rider was a young man, barely 20, wearing a slicker and a pinched, cold face. He was not a cowboy. He looked like a town man, a clerk. He pulled his horse up 20 yards from the cabin, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the shotgun in Eli's hands. "Mr. McRae?" the man called out, his voice thin in the damp air. "I am. I got a letter from Carbon, from Sheriff Hatcher." Eli said nothing. He just waited. the shotgun held loosely, its barrel pointed at the ground, but ready. The rider fumbled inside his coat, his gloved hands clumsy. He pulled out a folded, damp piece of paper. "He said to give this to you. He said it's official." "Leave it on the fence post," Eli said. "Sir, I'm supposed to wait for—" "Leave it." Eli's voice was flat, but it cut through the air. The rider's face paled. He spurred his horse forward, dropped the letter on the nearest post, and wheeled the animal around. He kicked it into a panicked, slipping run back through the mud, never looking back. Eli watched him go. He stood there for a full minute, until the rider was just a speck. Then he limped through the mud, his wooden legs sinking deep, and retrieved the letter. He came back inside, kicking the mud from his boot and his peg. Clara stood by the table, her hands clenched in her apron. She was trembling. He did not open the letter. He walked to the hearth, the paper held between two fingers. He looked at her. "The town," she whispered. "It's about me." He did not answer. He unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the few lines of cramped, official script. Clara watched his face. It did not change. It remained stone. But the muscle in his jaw began to jump, a rapid, angry pulse. He read it twice. Then, slowly, he folded the letter, knelt, and pushed it into the heart of the fire. Clara gasped. "What did it say?" "Nothing," he said. "It must have said something. What do they want? Eli, you have to tell me." He stood, his shadow looming large in the small room. He looked at the flames as they consumed the paper, turning the sheriff's words into black, curling ash. "It's handled," he said. He turned and went to the pegs, pulling down his heavy coat, the one she had mended. He checked his shotgun, breaking it open to confirm the shells were seated. He grabbed a handful of extra shells from a box on the mantel and shoved them into his pocket. "Where are you going?" she cried, panic rising in her. "Eli, you can't." "Stay inside. Bar the door," he said. He did not look at her. He pulled his hat down low and walked out. She ran to the door. "They'll hurt you. It's me they want. Don't go." But he was already at the barn, his thump-drag gait fast and furious in the mud. He was not a man who could be stopped. Clara stood in the doorway, the cold, damp air chilling her to the bone, and watched as he led his roan out, saddled it with rough, angry movements, and hauled himself up. He rode out, heading south toward Carbon, his back a rigid line of defiance. Clara barred the door, and she waited. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, a predator. The sound of the melting snow, drip, 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 was the only clock. She tried to sew, but her hands were shaking too badly. She paced the floor. She imagined the town, the smug face of Mrs. Finch, the weak-willed sheriff. They would mock him. They would call him a fool for sheltering her. They would call her a whore. He was one man, with one good leg, against all of them. He was riding into that nest of judgment for her, and he had not even told her why. The gray light of the afternoon began to fade. The fire burned low. She did not bother to add wood. The cold crept into the cabin. She sat on her cot, wrapped in her blanket, and prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. It was full dark. Hours passed when he should have returned, when she heard the horse. It was a slow, tired sound, not the angry, determined pace of his departure. She ran to the door, her fingers fumbling with the heavy wooden bar. She pulled it open. He was dismounting, moving like an old man. The roan stood with its head down, lathered and muddy. Eli slumped against the horse for a long moment, breathing hard, before he turned and limped toward the cabin. He stumbled on the porch step and caught himself on the doorframe. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice a breath. "No," he growled. He pushed past her into the dark room. Clara shut the door and lit the lamp. The yellow light flooded the room. and she saw his hand. His knuckles were split open. Dried blood was caked across his right hand, mixed with mud. It was the hand of his good side. "Your hand," she said, reaching for it. He snatched it back. "I said I ain't hurt." "You're bleeding. Let me clean it." "Leave it, woman," he snapped, his voice raw. He went to the fire and threw a log on, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped. "What happened?" she whispered. What did the letter say? He was quiet for a long time. She could hear him breathing, a low, ragged sound. They said you were wanted," he finally said, his voice low. "For theft, for immoral conduct. They demanded I turn you over. So what did you do?" I told them no. Clara's knees felt weak. She gripped the back of a chair. "Your hand. You fought them." "There was a man in the saloon, Jebediah Finch, the banker's boy." Eli's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He said something. About you, about me. He said he knew what kind of woman you were. He said he knew what a cripple was paying for." Clara's stomach turned to ice. "I broke his jaw," Eli said, still staring into the fire. She closed her eyes. He had defended her. This broken, silent man had walked into the town that shunned him and defended her honor with his fists. What did the sheriff do?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Hatcher's a coward, but he's a town coward. He can't have his banker's son laid out in the street." Eli finally turned to look at her, his face exhausted and grim. "He gave me 1 week, 7 days. Then he's coming here, with a posse. He said send her packing or they'll burn us out." 1 week, the words echoed in the silence. 7 days. Clara started. "I'll go. I'll leave in the morning. I won't have you." "You'll go nowhere," he interrupted, his voice cutting. "The pass is a river of mud. You wouldn't make it a mile. And that storm that's been hanging north, it's coming. I can smell it. But they'll—" "I said you're not going," he said. He limped to the table, picked up the whiskey bottle, and pulled the cork. He didn't offer it to her this time. He took a long, burning pull. "Eli," she pleaded, "they'll burn your home. Again." The moment she said it, she knew she had made a mistake. His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a cold, white-hot rage she had not seen since the day he found her with the photograph. "Don't," he whispered. "Don't you ever speak of that." He grabbed the bottle and his coat and slammed out of the door, leaving her alone in the sudden, terrible silence, the ultimatum hanging in the air. He did not come back that night. Clara lay on her cot, fully dressed, listening to the wind rise. The false spring was over. The temperature was dropping, and the first hard pellets of ice began to rattle against the windows. The new storm was here. She knew what she had to do. He was stubborn. He was a fool. He would die here, defending her, a woman he didn't even trust. She would not be his ruin. Sarah had been his ruin. She would not be another. She rose before dawn. The cabin was ice cold. The fire was dead. Eli's bunk was empty. She moved with a quiet, desperate purpose. She went to her carpet bag. She packed her few things, her journal, her sewing kit, her other dress. She went to the pantry. She took a half-dozen biscuits from the tin, a strip of dried venison, and a small sack of coffee. She was stealing from him, but it was to save him. She scribbled a note on a piece of wrapping paper. "Thank you. I am sorry." She left it on the table. She bundled herself in every layer she owned, pulled on the heavy boots, and slipped out the door. The world was a maelstrom of white. The storm he had predicted was here, a full-blown blizzard, far worse than the one that had nearly killed her before. The wind tore the breath from her lungs. She could barely see the barn, just a dark shape through the swirling snow. She had to get her mule. The mule was her only chance. She fought her way to the barn, her legs sinking deep in the new drifts. She pulled the heavy barn door open, slipping inside, out of the wind. The barn was dark, filled with the warm, humid smell of hay and animals. The roan and the 2 cows lowed softly from their stalls. Her mule was at the far end, and Eli was there. He was not sleeping. He was sitting on a hay bale in the empty stall next to her mule, slumped against the wooden partition. An empty whiskey bottle lay on its side in the straw. Another, half full, was in his hand. He was drunk. He was so drunk he did not seem to have heard her enter. He was talking to himself, or to someone who wasn't there. His voice was thick and slurred, but she could hear the words. "Liar." He was whispering, "Liar, all of you, all of them." He lifted his hand, and in the dim light, she saw what he was holding. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and dark. He stared at it, his face contorted. "You said, forever, Sarah," he slurred. "You said, and you... He made a sound, a low, choked noise that was half sob, half growl. He was crying, not the quiet, dignified tears of a grieving man, but the ugly, broken, racking sobs of a man who had lost everything. His shoulders, broad even under his coat, were shaking. Clara stood frozen. This was a private grief, a wound so deep it was still bleeding after 5 years. She should not be here. She should turn and run. But she could not. She watched as he raised the locket to his face, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was screaming, Sarah," Eli whispered, the words tearing from his throat. "Our boy, Jacob, he was screaming for you, for me, and the smoke, God, the smoke." He leaned forward, his head bowed, and the sobs took him completely. Clara let her carpetbag drop into the straw. The sound was soft, but he heard it. His head snapped up, his eyes, red-rimmed and wild, found her in the darkness. "Get out," he snarled, trying to get to his feet, but he was too drunk, his wooden legs slipping in the hay. "Get out! Leave me be!" He swiped at her, as if she were a ghost. Clara did not move. She walked toward him, her heart pounding. She was not afraid of him. Not anymore. She stopped in front of him. He looked up at her, his face a ruin of whiskey and despair. She did it," he choked out, the confession bursting from him. Needing a witness. "The raiders, they weren't just raiders. She knew them. She was with one of them. She let them in. She helped them. For money. For him." Clara knelt in the straw, her eyes never leaving his face. "I woke up. The house was on fire. I ran for Jacob. He was in his room. The roof was coming in. I got to him, but the beam, it fell. It took my leg, and it trapped us. I could hear her. Outside, I heard her laughing." He was gasping for air, the words poisoning him. "I held him. I held my boy, and he burned. He died screaming for his mama. And she was laughing." He fell silent, his breath hitching, his gaze lost, staring at the barn wall, seeing the fire. "I got out. I don't know how. I crawled out, and my leg was gone, just fire. And they were gone. She was gone. With them. She left me. She left me to burn with our son." He looked down at the locket in his hand. "This was hers. I found it. In the ashes. It's all that's left." He closed his fist around it, his bloody knuckles white. "And I hate it. I hate her. I hate—" He could not finish. He bowed his head, defeated. Clara was quiet for a long time. The only sounds were the wind howling outside and the soft lowing of the cattle. She had thought her own pain was vast. She had thought the cruelty of carbon was the end of the world. But this was a hell she could not imagine. She reached out, her chapped, work-worn hands moving slowly. She did not touch the locket. She did not touch his hand. She cupped his face. He flinched, his eyes snapping to hers, startled. Her hands were cold from the storm, but they were steady. She held his rough, whiskey-soaked, tear-stained face between her palms. He stared at her, his breathing ragged. "You are not her," Clara said, her voice low and fierce. "And you are not him. You are not the fire." She held his gaze, forcing him to see her, to see the truth. "She is gone. Your son is gone. The fire is out." Her thumbs gently brushed the tears from his cheeks. "But you still breathe. Eli, that means something." He looked at her, his eyes searching her face, as if seeing her for the first time, the wildness, the grief, the rage. It all seemed to pause, held at bay by her touch. He saw her. Clara, he saw her strength, the resolve that had kept her alive, the same resolve that had kept him alive. He leaned forward, his movement clumsy, desperate. He pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was rough, tasting of whiskey and salt and 5 years of agonizing loneliness. It was a drowning man's grasp for air. Clara's first instinct was to recoil. She put her hands on his chest, her fingers splayed and pushed. This was not comfort. This was desperation. This was hunger. This was something she was not ready for. But he held on, his hand coming up to tangle in her hair, holding her fast. He kissed her again, a raw, pleading, angry kiss. And something in her broke. Her own loneliness, her own fear, her own desperate, unspoken hunger rose to meet his. She had been cold for so long. She had been righteous and wronged and so very, very alone. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, suddenly clenched, grabbing the front of his coat. She stopped fighting him and kissed him back. She kissed him with all the fear and rage and grief that matched his own. It was a kiss of survivors, a kiss of two people who had been to the very edge of the abyss and had not fallen. It was desperate. It was hungry. It was, for a moment, the only thing in the world. He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, lifting her from her knees. He buried his face in her neck, his breathing hot against her cold skin. "Clara," he murmured, the name a prayer or a curse. The cold of the barn was seeping in. The storm was howling. They were both shaking, from the cold, from the whiskey, from the sudden, violent eruption of feeling. "The cabin," he growled, his voice thick. He pulled away, but kept one hand on her arm. He used the stall to heave himself to his feet. His wooden leg was unsteady, but he was upright. He pulled her toward the door. They stumbled out of the barn and into the blizzard. The wind was a solid wall of ice, screaming in their ears. They could not see the cabin, but they knew the way. They bent their heads against the storm, Eli dragging his leg, Clara holding him steady, and they fought their way through the drifts, two shadows in the white. They burst through the cabin door, falling inside, bringing a cloud of snow and ice with them. Eli kicked the door shut and through the bar. The cabin was freezing, the fire dead, but the air between them was electric, thick with the unsaid, with the kiss, with the confession. They stood in the center of the room, breathing hard, snow melting in their hair, dripping onto the floor. He was still holding her hand, his grip crushing. He looked at her, his eyes dark, the whiskey and the grief and the desire warring in his face. He took a step toward her. She did not back away. He reached out and, with a trembling hand, touched her cheek. She was afraid. She was terrified. Of him, of this, of what it meant, of being hurt again. She looked at his bunk, a dark shape in the corner, and then back at him. Her voice was a small, trembling whisper. "Don't force it," she breathed. "Will it fit?" It was a question about everything, about her past, about his, about the scars they both carried, the visible and the invisible. Could their broken pieces ever align? Eli heard her. He heard the fear beneath the question. The drunken haze in his eyes cleared, replaced by a sudden, fierce clarity. He did not pull her toward the bed. He stepped closer, bringing her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. He could feel her heart hammering like a trapped bird. He lowered his head, his lips brushing the cold skin of her temple, then her jaw, then the soft, vulnerable space behind her ear. He breathed her in. He held her close, his arms a fortress against the storm outside and the storms inside. His voice was a low, rough murmur, vibrating against her neck, a promise spoken in the dark. "I'll make it fit tonight." The light that woke Clara was gray and thin, filtered through the small, snow-caked window. The cabin was silent, save for the muffled howl of the blizzard outside. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, and the room was terribly cold. She was in his bed. The realization was a dull shock. She was pressed against the rough log wall, covered by his heavy buffalo hide. The space beside her was empty, but the straw-ticked mattress still held the shape of his body and the scent of him, of whiskey, wood smoke, and a faint, masculine musk, was all around her. Her cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the night's passion. It had not been passion. It had been something raw, a desperate collision of two half-dead things. It was his confession, her comfort, the whiskey, the storm. It was shame. She heard a small sound, the scrape of a boot on the floor. Her heart hammered. He was awake. He was at the hearth, his back to her, feeding kindling into the embers. Clara slipped from the bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing floorboards. She grabbed her clothes, which lay in a heap by his bunk, and fled to her own cot, her side of the room. She turned her back, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fasten the buttons of her chemise. She felt his eyes on her. She could feel his gaze like a physical weight on her shoulders, on her exposed back. She pulled her dress on, her movements jerky and panicked. Eli watched her. He was sober. His head throbbed, a dull axe blow behind his eyes. His leg ached from the damp. He remembered everything. His confession in the barn, a secret he had never uttered to another living soul. Her hands on his face, the kiss, the frantic, clumsy tumble into his bed. He saw her now, dressing with the haste of a woman escaping a sin. He felt a wave of self-loathing. He had taken her in his drunkenness, used her grief to quiet his own. He said nothing. He strapped on his wooden leg, his movements stiff. Clara finished dressing and, without looking at him, went to the water bucket, broke the skin of ice on top, and filled the coffee pot. She moved to the hearth, her body rigid, keeping her face turned away from him. The old routine, the old silence. But everything had changed. The invisible line she had drawn on the floor was gone, violated. The silence, which had become a shared space, was now thick with accusation and regret. He put on his coat. "The storm's bad," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I'll check the stock." He left. Clara leaned against the mantel, the coffee pot in her hand, and let out the breath she had been holding. The blizzard, which had trapped her, was now a reprieve. It had saved her from her flight, but it had also imprisoned her with the consequences. The storm lasted 2 more days, a howling white wall that buried the cabin to the windows. They were forced into a new rhythm. The shared work, which had once been a truce, was now a necessity that saved them from having to speak. They moved as a team, their silence born of a new, profound awkwardness. They dug a tunnel from the cabin door to the barn, the snow walls higher than their heads. He would shovel, his shoulders straining, and she would haul the snow away in a bucket. They fed the livestock in the blue, hazy light of the snowbound barn, their breath smoking in the air, their arms brushing as they forked hay into the stalls. They went to the creek, which was now a frozen, white expanse. Eli took the heavy maul and struck the ice, his one good leg braced, the thump of the blow echoing in the profound quiet. Clara knelt and pulled the sharp-edged, heavy chunks of ice from the hole, piling them into buckets to be melted for water. They worked, they ate, they survived. The raw desperation of that night in the barn receded, buried under the practical, relentless demands of the snow. And then the night came. The cabin was small. The world was nothing but the space between these four walls. They ate their supper of beans and salt pork at the small table, the silence stretching between them. Clara cleaned the bowls. She tended the fire. She mended a tear in his glove. The clock on the mantel ticked, loud as a hammer. It was time for sleep. She looked at her cot, a narrow, cold island. She looked at his bed, a larger, warmer territory, now freighted with meaning. She did not know the rules. Eli sat by the fire, oiling the leather on his new leg brace. He did not look at her. His face was set in the same hard, unreadable lines as always. He gave no sign, no invitation, but he did not tell her to go to her cot either. Clara made the choice. She was cold. She was lonely. And her body, woken by his, now held a low, persistent ache that had nothing to do with the work. She blew out the lamp on her side of the room. She walked the few steps across the cold floor, pulled back the heavy buffalo hide, and slipped into his bed. He tensed. She felt the muscles in his back go rigid. She lay on the very edge of the mattress, not touching him. An hour passed. She thought he was asleep. Then, in the darkness, he rolled over. His hand found her waist, his touch rough, hesitant. He pulled her against him. It was not tender. It was a raw, wordless confirmation. Their bodies ached for each other, for the warmth, for the simple, stunning comfort of another human being in the void. He kissed her, his mouth hard, and she met him. Their hearts remained locked, two iron-bound chests, but their bodies found a fierce, temporary peace. This became the new routine, days spent in silent, efficient partnership, nights spent in a dark, tangled, unspoken hunger. The blizzard broke. The world was scoured clean, brilliant white under a painfully blue sky. The snow was deep, but it was crusted, and travel was now possible for a man on a determined horse. The 7 days were long past. Clara had almost allowed herself to believe the town had forgotten. The rider came at midday. It was not the young clerk. It was a deputy, a man with a hard face and cold eyes, wearing his badge like a weapon. Eli saw him coming and met him on the porch, his shotgun in his hand. Clara watched from the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. "McRae," the deputy called, not dismounting, his horse snorting in the cold. "I'm here for Hatcher. He gave you a week. You're long past it." "I heard him," Eli said, his voice calm. "This is your final warning. The banker's son is raising hell. The town council's authorized it. You put that woman on a horse and send her down, or Hatcher's coming tomorrow at noon. And he's bringing a posse." "She's done nothing." "She's a wanted fugitive, according to the law in Carbon." The deputy sneered. "And you're harboring her. He'll give you one more chance. For the sake of your pa's name, give her up, or we'll burn this place to the ground, with you in it." Eli did not raise his voice. He just stood there, a solid, immovable object. "This is my land. She ain't a fugitive. She's under my protection. That's my final word." The deputy stared at him for a long moment, seeing the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "You're a damn fool. Cripple. You'll be dead by this time tomorrow." He wheeled his horse and rode away. His message delivered. Eli came back inside. He bolted the door. The cabin, which had become a strange, tense home, was now a tomb. Tomorrow, noon. Clara sank onto her cot. It was over. "You have to let me go," she said, her voice dead. "I will not. I will not be your fire. I will not be your Sarah." He was at the gun rack, checking his rifle, his movements methodical. "I ain't dying, and you ain't going. Why? She cried, her voice breaking. Why are you doing this? I'm nothing to you. I'm just a woman. I'm a whore. Eli, just like they say. He stopped, his hand freezing on the rifle's breech. Is that what you think this is? He asked, his voice low. What else is it? You don't know me. You don't know the worst of it. The words were spilling out. Her last defense. Her last, most terrible truth. If he knew this, he would let her go. He would have to. I told you about the drifter, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. That wasn't the first time I was ruined. He turned, slowly, to face her. I was young, she said, staring at her hands. Before I met Thomas, I was pregnant. She heard him draw in a sharp breath. I wasn't married. My family, they lived in Ohio. They were good people, God-fearing people. They were so ashamed. They said I was sick, that I was unwell. They sent me away, to an institution. She looked up, her eyes bright with a pain so old it was a part of her. They called it hysteria. They said I was fanciful, that I had imagined it. But I hadn't. I was carrying a child. She was back there, in that cold, whitewashed room, the smell of lye and boiled linen. When my time came, they took me, and when I woke up, the baby was gone. A little girl. They told me she had died, that she was born weak. But I heard her. Eli, just once, I heard her cry. Her voice broke. They lied. I know they lied. They gave her away. They stole her from me. They told me I was sick, that I had imagined the whole thing, that I was an unfit mother. They locked me away. She looked at him, this man who had lost his own child to fire. I am a mother who lost her child. I am the woman they put in an asylum. I am broken. Eli, I am not just a woman they call a harlot. I am the thing they lock away in the dark. She was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. So you see what you're protecting? I'm not worth your life. I'm not worth this ranch. Now you know. Eli stood as if struck. He had seen the cruelty of the raiders, the betrayal of his wife. But this was a cold, calculated cruelty, a theft so profound he could not grasp it. They had stolen her child. They had stolen her mind, told her she was crazy for grieving. He, who had been consumed by the loss of his son, was face to face with a woman who had her child taken. He was shaken to his very core. The hard, bitter shell he had built around himself cracked. Clara saw his silence. She saw his stunned, pale face, and she mistook it for judgment, for a final, cold disgust. Now you know, she whispered, broken. Do you still want me, knowing what I am? He crossed the room in 2 strides. His limp was heavy, the wooden leg thumping on the floor. He did not stop until he was kneeling in front of her cot. He did not touch her. He just knelt, his face level with hers. The town, he said, his voice rough. Hatcher, the raiders, my wife, the lies. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw a profound, weary clarity. They don't make sense, none of it. He reached out, his calloused, rough hand trembling. He did not touch her face. He cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, and gently, firmly, pulled her forehead to his. They stayed there, breathing the same air. You, he whispered, are the only thing that makes sense anymore. That night, the sheriff did not come. The sky, which had been clear, turned a dark, bruised purple. The wind began to rise, not a blizzard, but a deep, Arctic blast that drove the temperature down 30 degrees in an hour. Noon came. The cabin was silent. Eli stood at the window, rifle in hand. Clara sat at the table. Noon passed. The new storm hit, a true, high-country blizzard that buried the deputies' tracks and made the world outside the window disappear. They were trapped, not for a day, not for 2. They were trapped for 5 days. The cabin became their entire world. The threat of the posse was still out there, buried in the snow, waiting. But inside, something had shifted. Her confession, and his answer, had drained the poison. They talked, for the first time. They truly talked. He told her about Jacob, how his son had been quiet, like him, but had loved the smell of the pines, how he had wanted a dog. She told him about Thomas, how he had been kind, how he read poetry to her, but how he had been too frail for the world, how she had felt more like his mother than his wife. They sat by the fire, the wind screaming outside, a fortress of sound. They shared stories, they shared silence, and the silence was, at last, comfortable. One evening, he was sitting on his stool, his leg propped up, his face tight with pain from the cold. Clara knelt before him, as she had once before. She unstrapped the brace and began to massage the scarred stump, her hands firm, easing the ache in the old muscles. He didn't pull away. He watched her dark hair falling forward, her expression focused. When she was done, he did not look away. He reached out and touched her hair, his fingers brushing her cheek. "Clara," he said, just her name. That night, when she came to his bed, it was different. He pulled back the blanket for her. He held her, and when they came together, it was not the desperate, frantic coupling of before. It was slow. It was tender. It was a deliberate, quiet exploration. It was 2 people, scarred and frightened, learning to touch without causing pain. During the long days of the storm, Clara worked. She watched him. She saw the way his old leg brace, the one he had worn for 5 years, chafed his skin. The straps were cracked. The wood was rough. She was a seamstress. She understood leather and linen, tension and fit. She went to his supply chest. She found a piece of supple, cured saddle leather, dark and strong. She took the extra flannel from her own ruined petticoat, from the wood pile. She found a piece of seasoned hickory, and with his sharpest knife, she scraped and shaped it, following the curve of his old brace. For 2 days, she sat by the fire, her hands busy. She used her awl to punch the holes. She used waxed thread, her stitches small and tight, reinforcing every seam. She patted the inside of the wooden cup with a soft flannel, stitching it down so it would not bunch. She fashioned new straps, strong and wide. With new buckles, she polished clean. On the 5th morning of the storm, she was done. He was drinking coffee, watching her. She had been secretive, hiding it when he was near. She stood and, without a word, held it out to him. He took it. He turned it over in his large, rough hands. He saw the precision of the stitching, the strength of the straps. He felt the softness of the flannel lining. He looked at the smooth, sanded wood, shaped to fit him. He was a man who had received no gift, no act of true tenderness, in 5 years. He looked at her, and his throat was thick. He was deeply, profoundly moved. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He set his coffee down. He unstrapped his old, battered prosthetic. He set it on the floor. Then, he strapped her creation on. It fit perfectly. The straps were secure, the padded cup warm and soft against his scarred skin. He stood. He took a step. His thump drag was softer. The drag was almost gone. The brace moved with him, a part of him. He walked to the window and back. He looked at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "It'll hold," he said, his voice rough. The storm ended on the 6th morning. The silence that fell was heavy. The sheriff could come now. Clara woke before dawn, her heart a knot of dread. He would die. Eli would die, for her, and she would be left alone again, or dragged back to Carbon. She looked at him, asleep in the bed, his face softer, younger in the dim light. She could not let this happen. She slipped out of bed, her mind made up. She had to destroy her past. If the posse came, if they took her, they would not take her words. They would not find her journal, the one he had almost read. She pulled the small, cloth-bound book from her carpet bag. The letters to Thomas, to her mother, to Mrs. Finch. The raw, painful words about her baby. The fire was low, just embers. She knelt at the hearth. She tore the pages from the journal, sheaf by sheaf. She pushed the letters into the embers, watching the edges char and curl. They were damp. They would not catch. They smoked, the smell of burning paper filling the cabin. She heard him stir. Panicked, she raked the ashes over the pages, trying to bury them, and fled back to her cot, pulling the blanket up, her back to him, feigning sleep, her heart pounding. Eli woke to the smell of charring paper. He sat up. The cabin was dim. He saw Clara, a rigid line in her cot, her back to him, breathing too evenly. He limped to the hearth. He saw the disturbance in the ashes. He knelt, his new leg brace comfortable, quiet. He gently brushed the ashes away and saw the packet of charred-edged, damp pages. He pulled them out. They were warm. In the faint gray light of the dawn, he sat on his stool, and he read them. He read her fear, he read her loneliness. He read her desperate, angry words to Mrs. Finch. He read her shame about the drifter. He read her aching, hollow grief for the child she had never been allowed to hold. He read her words, written just days ago, her fear of being unworthy of his protection. He read every secret she had left. Clara, unable to feign sleep any longer, turned. She saw him sitting there, the burned pages spread on his knee. She saw his face. She had never felt so naked, so exposed. He knew all of it, every dirty, broken, ugly piece. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, waiting for the final, disgusted rejection. Eli finished the last page. He stacked the charred letters neatly on the hearthstone. He did not look at her. He stood and walked, not to his bed, but to her cot. He knelt beside it. He reached past her, to her small carpet bag. He opened it and pushed his hand into her sewing box. Clara flinched. "What are you doing?" His large fingers fumbled, clumsy among the needles and spools of thread. Then they closed. He pulled his hand out and walked back to the table, where he lit the lamp. The cabin filled with a soft, warm light. He stood there, waiting for her. Trembling, she got out of bed and walked toward him, her feet bare, her hair unbound. He looked at her, his eyes holding no judgment, only a deep, profound sadness. He showed her the burned letters on the hearth. "I read them," he said. She closed her eyes, bracing. "Clara," he said. She opened them. He held out his closed, rough fist. Slowly, he opened it. Resting in his scarred, calloused palm was a thin, simple gold band, her wedding ring, the one she had hidden from the world, the last symbol of a life she had lost, the one she had been too ashamed to wear and too heartbroken to throw away. He had read her deepest fears of being unworthy, and his answer was to give her back the symbol of her worth. He took her hand, his palm rough against hers, and he gently, carefully, placed the old ring back into her palm. He closed her fingers around it. The ring was cold in her palm. Clara sat on the edge of her cot, the gray dawn light filling the cabin. The snow had stopped, and the silence outside was heavy, absolute. Eli was at the hearth, his back to her, stoking the fire. He had read her letters. He knew her shame, and he had not thrown her out. He had given her back her ring. She looked at the simple gold band. It was Thomas's ring, a symbol of a life that was gone, of a woman who was gentle and respectable and had died in an asylum. And it was Eli's gift, a symbol of her worth, a silent answer to the question she had been screaming in her journal. Am I worthy? But the answer given in the cabin was not an answer for the world. The posse was still out there. Sheriff Hatcher was still in Carbon. The warrant, the lies, the accusation of whore, all waited at the bottom of the melting canyon. She could not live like this. She could not be the woman he had risked his life for, the woman who had shared his bed, and still be a fugitive hiding behind his shotgun. She could not let him become a hermit again, hiding her instead of just his grief. She slipped the ring onto the third finger of her left hand. It felt strange, heavy. She stood. "I'm going to town," she said. Eli froze, the poker in his hand. He turned slowly, his face grim. "No, you ain't." "I have to." She was already pulling on her coat, the one he had given her. "I told you, I'll handle Hatcher." "You handled Jebediah Finch. You didn't handle the lie," she said, her voice quiet but unbending. "They will just come back. They will come back when the snow is gone, and they will come with more men. They will burn this place. Eli, they will finish what Sarah started, because of me." "Then we'll fight," he said, his voice a low growl. "No." She met his gaze. He saw the woman from the asylum, the woman who had hit a man with a hot iron, the woman who had survived eviction in a blizzard. "I'm done fighting, and I'm done hiding." He crossed the room in 2 strides, his limp heavy. He grabbed her arm, his grip just short of painful. "Clara, don't. They will not listen to you. They will arrest you. They will." "What?" she interrupted. "Call me a harlot? Put me in a cell? I've been in worse places than a cell in Carbon. I've been in a place where they tell you your own mind is a lie." She placed her free hand on his chest. "You read the letters. You know what they did to me. I let them. I let my family, and the doctors, and Mrs. Finch. I let them all tell me who I was." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and cold with resolve. "You said I was the only thing that made sense, but I don't make sense if I'm still that woman. If we are to be free, I have to." He searched her face, his jaw tight. He was looking for a crack, for a sign of fear he could use to stop her. He found none. He saw only himself, the same stubborn, wounded pride that had kept him alive on this mountain. He let go of her arm. "I'm coming with you." "No," she said again, more gently. "This one part, I have to do alone. I have to walk in there as Clara Reed, the seamstress, not as your woman, not as your prisoner, just me. They have to see me." He wanted to rage. He wanted to lock her in the cabin and face the posse himself. It was a physical sickness, the idea of letting her ride into that town alone, but he saw the truth in her words. He had defended her honor. Only she could reclaim it. "I'll be behind you," he said, his voice rough. "I'll give you till noon, then I'm coming in." She nodded. "That is fair." She went to the barn. She did not take the carpet bag she had tried to flee with. She took nothing. She saddled the mule, the one he had saved, the one she had bought with her last dollars. She rode out, her back straight, and did not look back. Eli watched her go. He watched her until her small, determined shape disappeared into the dazzling, sunlit white of the canyon. The moment she was gone, he went to the barn, saddled his roan, and grabbed his shotgun. He gave her an hour's head start. It was the longest hour of his life. The ride to Carbon was a slog through melting snow and thick, freezing mud. The town stank of wet coal ash and manure. It was mid-morning, and the main street was busy. She saw faces she recognized, women who had once been her customers, men who had tipped their hats. They stopped. They stared. She saw them whisper, "That's her, the harlot, McRae's woman." Clara ignored them. She tied her mule to the hitching post outside the one place she had dreaded, the place where the lie had been born, Finch's Mercantile. She pushed the door open. The bell above it jangled, a cheerful, sickening sound. The store was warm, smelling of coffee beans, bolts of wool, and cured tobacco. Mr. Finch, the banker, was at the counter, tallying his ledger. His wife, Agatha Finch, was sorting ribbons, her back to the door, and leaning against the pot-bellied stove, his arm in a sling, his jaw a swollen, purple mass, was Jebediah Finch. The store went silent. "What do you think you're doing here?" "Mr. Finch said, his voice low, looking up from his book. "I'm here for my pay." "Mr. Finch," Clara said. Her voice was steady. It did not shake. Agatha Finch turned, her face a mask of pinched, righteous fury. "Get out! Get out of this store, you filthy creature! We will not have you in here." "I am here for the $12 you owe me," Clara repeated, her gaze fixed on the older man. "You are owed nothing." "Mrs. Finch snapped. "You are a thief and a whore, and the sheriff will be here any moment to—" "He assaulted me," Clara said, her voice cutting through the woman's tirade. The store was suddenly, completely still. Jebediah, who had been trying to look invisible, went pale. "That's a lie," he stammered, his words thick from his broken jaw. She invited me." "I did not," Clara said. She took one step toward him. He flinched. "You came to my room. You were drunk. You put your hands on me, and I hit you with an iron. That is the truth." You... Jebediah looked to his mother for help. "How dare you!" Agatha Finch stepped between them. "You accuse my son. You who were seen with that drifter. You who fled town to go live in sin with that cripple." "I fled town," Clara said, her voice rising, "because you lied about me. You told the town I was a harlot because you could not bear to think your son was a drunken brute. You told the sheriff I was a thief so you wouldn't have to pay me the $12 you owed me." A crowd was forming at the door. The whispers from the street had drawn them. Miners, the blacksmith, other women, they were peering in, listening. "This is madness," Mr. Finch said, slamming his ledger shut. "Sheriff! Someone get the sheriff!" "He assaulted me," Clara said again, louder for the crowd. "And she called me a whore to cover it, and he called me a thief to save $12. "That's enough." Sheriff Hatcher pushed his way through the crowd, his face red with anger. He had been played for a fool, and here was the proof. "Clara Reed, you are under arrest for theft and for public disturbance." He grabbed her arm. The crowd murmured. "Get your hand off her." The voice was not a shout. It was a low, cold command, and it cut through the room like a razor. Eli McRae stood in the doorway. He was not on his horse. He was standing on his own 2 feet, his new leg brace planted solid on the boardwalk. He held his shotgun, its long, dark barrel resting in the crook of his arm, pointed at no one, and at everyone. Hatcher's hand dropped from Clara's arm as if it had been burned. "McRae," Hatcher said, his hand moving toward his own pistol. "This is town law. This is an official warrant. You stand down." "No," Eli said. He took one step into the store. Thump, drag. The sound was heavy, final. "The warrant's a lie. The law's a lie. You know it. He knows it." He nodded at Mr. Finch. "And she knows it." He looked at Agatha Finch, and his gaze was so cold, so full of contempt, that she physically recoiled. "This ain't your business," Hatcher said, his voice losing its nerve. "She is my business." Eli said. He looked at Clara, and then at the crowd. "But she belongs to no one but herself, and she ain't a thief." The standoff was absolute. The sheriff, the banker, and the banker's wife, all held captive by one man with a shotgun and a wooden leg. Clara was the one who broke the silence. Her voice was strong. "I am not a thief," she said to the crowd, to the sheriff. "Mr. Finch, you owe me $12 for mending 3 coats and 6 blankets. You refused to pay." She looked at Hatcher. "I left this town with $7, saved from my own work. I have the receipt from Silas at the livery. I paid $6 for a lame mule. I had $1 in my pocket when Mr. McRae found me, dying in the snow. I have that dollar still." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the single, worn silver dollar. She threw it on the counter. It rang loud in the silence. "That is all I have. I stole nothing. He stole from me." She pointed at Mr. Finch. The crowd erupted in murmurs. They knew Mr. Finch. They knew his prices. They knew his hard dealings. And they looked at Clara, her thin face, her worn coat, her absolute unwavering stillness. They believed her. They looked at Jebediah, hiding behind his mother. They looked at Mrs. Finch, her face purple with rage. The lie had cracked wide open. Sheriff Hatcher saw it. He saw the crowd turning. He saw Eli's finger resting on the shotgun's trigger. He saw his town, his authority, dissolving. He had to save face. "Well," Hatcher cleared his throat, trying to regain his official tone. "There seems to be a disagreement, a financial dispute." He glared at Mr. Finch. "This ain't a matter for a warrant." "She accused my son," Agatha shrieked. "And she's accusing you," a man yelled from the crowd. Hatcher held up his hands. "It's over. The warrant is voided. There's no proof of theft." He looked at Eli. "McRae, get her, and get out of this town. And you," he said to the Finches. "Go home, all of you. It's over." Eli lowered the shotgun. He nodded. Once, to the sheriff. He did not look at the Finches. He looked at Clara. He offered her his arm. She walked past the Finches, past the sheriff, and took his arm. Together. They walked out of the store. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and fear. They rode north. The town was behind them, a bad memory sinking into the mud. They rode in silence for miles. The sound of the wind in the pines and the suck of the horses' hooves the only noise. The air was cold, but it was clean. As the ranch came into view, perched on the high slope, Eli pulled his roan to a halt. He looked at the cabin, the barn, the vast, empty wilderness that had been his prison for 5 years. He looked at the woman beside him. "I reckon I'm done hiding," he said. It was not to her. It was to the mountains, to the sky, to the ghosts. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. The wind dried them. She urged her mule closer to his roan. She leaned her head, heavy with the day, heavy with the past, and rested it on his solid, wool-covered shoulder. He hesitated, his arm stiff at his side. Then, slowly, his arm came up and wrapped around her, pulling her close. They sat there for a long time, just breathing, as the sun began to drop behind the peaks. That night, the cabin was warm. The threat was gone. It was truly, finally, just the two of them. After their supper, Eli stood. He went to the mantel. He took down the small, warped tin frame, the picture of Sarah, the woman with the dark, laughing eyes who had burned his life to the ground. He looked at it, his face hard, and then he looked at Clara, who was watching him from the table. He walked to the hearth and knelt. He did not throw the picture in. He placed it gently on the hot coals. The tin warped, the glass cracked, the image of the laughing woman curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. Clara stood. She went to the small shelf where the sheriff's notices, the letter of eviction, the threat from the posse, lay in a pile. She picked them up. She walked to the fire and knelt beside Eli. She added the papers to the fire. They burned fast, a bright, angry flare of orange. They knelt there together, watching the last of their pasts turn to smoke. The snow melted. It was a slow, dripping, muddy affair, but it happened. The world, which had been white and gray, returned. The ground, dark and rich, smelled of damp earth and pine. The creek, which had been a solid band of ice, roared with life, a torrent of melted snow. And with the spring came life. Along the fence line, where the snow had been deepest, the first wildflowers bloomed, bright purple lupine and shy, white anemones. Clara would walk the fence line, her hands raw from work, and gather them. "We need a garden," she said one evening. "Ground's too hard here," he said, tapping his pipe. "Too much rock." "Not for herbs," she said. "By the south wall. It gets the most sun." He looked at the spot. He nodded. "It'll work." He found old, warped window frames he had salvaged from the fire, frames he had been saving for 5 years. Though he knew not why, he had known, perhaps. He built a small, lean-to greenhouse against the cabin, a structure of old wood and wavy, bubbled glass. Clara was filled with a joy so sharp it was almost painful. She planted thyme and sage and yarrow. She gathered the wildflowers from the hills and began experimenting, boiling them down to make dyes. The cabin, once drab and gray, was now draped with skeins of wool dyed pale yellow from the rabbit brush, and soft lavender from the lupine. She was a creator. He had given her back the earth. He watched her. He watched her trying to spin the wool from his few sheep with a small, hand-carved drop spindle. It was slow, laborious work. He went to the barn. In the back, under a canvas tarp, was a stack of seasoned timber, oak and pine, wood he had saved from the main house, wood that had been cured by time and smoke. He began to carve. He worked at night, after she was asleep. His large hands, which were rough with rope and tools, which had broken a man's jaw, became precise. He carved the wheel. He fashioned the flyer. He built the footman. 2 weeks later, he brought it into the cabin. She stopped, her hands wet with dye. It was a spinning wheel. It was rough, heavy, and unmistakably his. The wood was dark, smoothed by his knife, and it smelled of the old fire. She walked to it. She touched the wheel. She sat, and she placed her foot on the treadle. It moved. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Eli." "It'll work," he said gruffly, and went outside to chop wood he did not need. The nights were warm now. The blizzard was a distant, cold memory. They lay in his bed, the windows open to the sound of the roaring creek. The intimacy between them was no longer a desperate hunger. It was a known comfort, a deep, quiet rhythm. She lay with her head on his chest, her fingers tracing the old, puckered scar on his arm, the one the fire had left. He knew her past. He knew the asylum, the stolen child, the shame. She knew the fire, the betrayal, the sun. They knew everything. The old voices, the ones from the asylum, the ones from Carbon, were quiet now, but they still whispered. In the deepest part of the night, she raised her head, looking at him in the moonlight. "Do you still want me?" she whispered. "Even now? Even now that I am not just a victim you saved? Even now that I am whole? Even now that you know I am broken?" He did not hesitate. He moved, shifting his weight, until he was looking down at her. He held her face between his 2 large hands, his gaze holding hers, steady and sure, more than anything that ever lived. The summer that followed was the first true peace either of them had known. The high mountain air was clean, the canyon was green, and the ranch, once a fortress of grief, became a home. Eli worked the fences, his new leg brace moving with him, his thump drag now a steady, rhythmic sound on the earth. He no longer looked at the burned-out foundation of his old house with rage. He looked at the new greenhouse he had built, where Clara's herbs grew thick and fast. Clara, in turn, bloomed. She was a creator. Her dyes, brewed from the wildflowers, were bright. Her spinning wheel was rarely silent. She was making things, not just mending them. They had a routine, a partnership of shared work and quiet. Certain nights, The ghosts had been burned. The past was ash. The world, however, was not finished with them. In August, a peddler named Abernathy, a man who traded goods and news from Cheyenne to Denver, guided his mule up their canyon. Eli greeted him with a watchful, but not hostile. "Aye." Clara came from her garden, wiping her hands on her apron, ready to trade her dyed wool for sugar and coffee. Abernathy was a talker. He spoke of the railroad, of politics, of a new silver strike, and he spoke of Denver. "Strangest thing I saw," he said, accepting a dipper of water. "I deliver goods to the home of the Good Shepherd, an orphanage, a hard place. They farm the children out to work. I was at a laundry, a terrible, steamy place on the south side." Clara, sorting her skeins of yellow wool, listened politely. "There was a girl there," Abernathy continued, his eyes glancing at Clara. "Maybe 12 years old, skinny as a rail, hands red from the lye. But she looked up when I came in. And I tell you, ma'am, it gave me a turn. She had your exact eyes, that same deep, clear blue, but old eyes in a child's face." Clara's hands went still. The wool fell from her lap. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her ice cold in the August heat. What did you say?" she whispered. "Just an observation, ma'am," Abernathy said, uncomfortable. "A resemblance. I'm sure it's nothing." "My child is dead," Clara said, the words sharp, automatic. "She was born weak. She died." The peddler shrugged. "Maybe so. Yes, I'm sure of it. Well, shall we see about that coffee?" Clara trembled. She could not speak. She stumbled back into the cabin, sat on her cot, and wrapped her arms around herself. Eli finished the trade, his face grim, and sent the man on his way. He came inside. The cabin was dark. Clara was rocking back and forth, her eyes wide with a terror he had not seen since the blizzard. "It's a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It's a cruel, cruel trick, a resemblance. That's all." Eli stood over her. He saw it, the hope. It was a terrible, agonizing thing. The hope she had buried in that asylum. The hope she had tried to burn with her letters. It was back. "She's dead," Clara insisted, trying to convince herself. "It would be too cruel. Eli, I can't." "We leave tomorrow," he said. She looked up, her face stricken. "No! What if it's not her? What if it's just a girl? What if it is her? And she looks at me?" "Then we'll know," he said, his voice rough. He put his hand on her head, his fingers gripping her hair, forcing her to be still. "It's a 2-day ride to the railhead, another day to Denver. We leave at dawn. You ain't facing this alone, and we ain't hiding from it." It was the first time he had left the ranch, truly left it, in 5 years. They locked the cabin, left the cattle in the high pasture, and rode south. Clara on the mule, Eli on the roan. He was a man of the mountain and the high prairie, flat and endless, made him tense. The train was worse, a screaming iron monster, rattling and shuddering, full of strange faces. Eli sat rigid, his shotgun at his feet, his hand never leaving Clara's. Denver was a scar on the earth. It was loud, filthy, and crowded, a city of coal smoke, mud, and the smell of raw sewage. Eli, accustomed to the clean silence of the peaks, felt his teeth grind. His leg ached from the damp, and he hated the way people stared at his limp, then looked away. Clara was a ghost, her eyes wide, seeing nothing, following him as he led them through the streets. He found the laundry. It was in a sagging brick building, down an alley rank with filth. The windows were opaque with steam. The moment Eli pushed the door open, a wall of heat and the chemical stench of lye and boiled. Dirty linen hit them. A large, sweating woman with a stained apron, Mrs. Grimes, looked up from a trough. "We ain't hiring," she barked. "We're not looking for work," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, his presence large and grim, with a shotgun held loosely, made the woman pause. "We're looking for a girl." Clara stepped forward, her voice a reedy whisper. "A girl, from the home of the Good Shepherd, about 12 years old." "Mrs.?" Grimes's eyes narrowed. "I got 3 of 'em, indentured till they're 16. You from the home?" "No," Clara said. "Then you got no business." "This girl," Clara pressed. "Does she have blue eyes?" "Mrs.?" Grimes laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Who knows? They're all half dead from the steam. Beth, get up front." A small figure detached from the shadows at the back, hauling a wooden basket of wet clothes. She was small for 12, her hair a lank, damp brown, her dress a gray, formless sack. She stopped when she saw them, her shoulders hunched, expecting a blow. "What?" she muttered, not looking up. Clara stared. She could not breathe. She saw the shape of her own hands, her mother's jawline. She saw nothing, just a tired, dirty child. "Beth," Clara breathed. The girl looked up, and Clara's world stopped. The eyes, they were her eyes, the deep, clear blue, clouded with exhaustion and a profound, hollow weariness. "Beth," Clara said again, taking a step. My name is Clara Reed. The words caught in her throat. How could she say it? "I am your mother." The girl's face did not light with joy. It crumpled, not with sadness, but with pure, animal terror. "No," the girl whispered. "You ain't." "I am. I looked for—" "You're a liar," the girl shrieked, backing away. "My mother's dead. The sisters at the home said so. She was wicked, and she died. Go away." She threw the basket down and scrambled back into the steam-filled depths of the laundry, disappearing like a phantom. "You upset her, Mrs.?" Grimes snapped, pointing a thick, red finger. "She's a good worker. You get out. Get out of my laundry." Eli took Clara's arm. She was frozen, her face as white as chalk. "Clara, we're going." He pulled her out of the steam, into the relative cool of the alley. Clara slid down the rough brick wall, her legs giving way. She buried her face in her hands. It was not a cry of grief. It was a dry, rasping sob of pure despair. "She hates me," she choked out. "Oh, God, Eli, she's alive, and she hates me. They told her I was wicked. They were right. I left her. Eli stood over her, his shadow blocking the sliver of sun. He let her cry. He let the raw, agonizing pain of it pour out. There in the filth of the alley, he waited, his hand on his shotgun, a silent sentinel. When her sobs subsided into shudders, he knelt beside her, his bad legs splayed stiffly. He did not touch her. "She's alive," he said, his voice rough. "That's the start. She ain't a ghost." "But she said—" "She's a child, and she's scared, and they lied to her," he said. He looked at the laundry door, his face hard. "She don't have to understand yet. She just has to be safe. You don't run. You just stay." He stood, his face set. "Wait here." He went back into the laundry. Clara heard his voice, a low, non-negotiable rumble. She heard Mrs. Grimes's voice, high and protesting. Then, silence. 5 minutes later, Eli emerged. He held the hand of the girl, Beth, who was carrying a small, pathetic bundle tied in a rag. Her face was streaked with tears, and she was staring at Eli with pure terror. "How?" Clara stammered, getting to her feet. "I bought her indenture," Eli said flatly. "Cost $20. The woman was agreeable." Beth flinched as Clara stepped toward her. I don't want to go," the girl whispered. pulling back. "You ain't staying here," Eli said, his voice not unkind, but absolute. He looked at Clara. "She'll ride the mule." The journey home was 3 days of agonizing silence. Beth rode the mule, her small back rigid, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. She never spoke. She ate the food they gave her, her movements quick, like a stray dog expecting a kick. Clara rode behind Eli on the roan, her arms around his waist, but her entire being was focused on the small girl in front of them. She wanted to run to her, to hold her, to explain, but Eli's words echoed in her mind. "Just stay." When they reached the ranch, Beth slid from the mule. She stood in the yard, looking at the cabin, the greenhouse, the vast, silent wall of the mountains rising up to the sky. She had known only gray walls and gray steam. "Where is this?" she asked, her first words. "This is home," Clara said softly. Beth looked at the cabin, then at Clara. "This ain't my home." They gave her the cot. For a week, she was a ghost in the cabin. She ate, she slept, and she sat by the window, watching. She watched Eli's heavy, limping gait. She watched Clara at the spinning wheel. She was waiting for the work, for the rules, for the punishment. None came. On the 8th day, Clara sat on the porch, brushing her long, dark hair in the afternoon sun. She had left it unbound. Beth came to the doorway and just stood there, watching. The rhythmic pull of the brush, the shine of the hair. It was a simple, quiet, domestic act, something the girl had never witnessed. Clara stopped. She held the wooden-backed brush out to the girl. "Would you?" Beth stared at the brush. She looked at Clara's back. She took a hesitant step forward. She took the brush. Her fingers, still scarred and red from the lie, were clumsy. She had never brushed another's hair, only hauled wet laundry. She touched the hair. It was soft. She pulled the brush through, clumsily at first, then with more confidence. She began to separate the strands, her small fingers slowly, instinctively, braiding. Clara sat perfectly still, her eyes closed. As silent tears streamed down her face, she felt the light, hesitant touch of her daughter's hands in her hair. It was a beginning. The girl thawed like the spring. She was quiet, but she was not empty. She had Clara's resilience and a core of strength that the asylum and the laundry had not broken. She learned to help in the garden, her hands, which had only known lie, learning the feel of soil. Eli carved her a small, perfect bird from a piece of pine. She took it, studied it, and clutched it. That night, Clara saw her sleeping with it held tight in her hand. She began to talk. She asked Eli about his leg. He told her. "A fire." She asked Clara about the spinning wheel. Clara showed her. She learned to spin, her hands finding a new, gentler rhythm. The cabin was no longer silent. It held the murmur of two women, a mother and a daughter, learning each other's language. That night, Beth was asleep on her cot, the wooden bird on the shelf above her. The cabin was warm, the sound of the creek a gentle rush outside. Eli and Clara lay in their bed. The house was full. The last, deepest wound was closing. He looked at her in the moonlight. He saw the peace on her face. The lines of terror around her eyes finally softened. She was no longer a survivor. She was a woman. She was a mother. He reached out and touched her face. She turned to him, and the love she felt was so vast, so complete. It left no room for fear. There was no desperation, no storm, no whiskey, no ghosts. When they came together, it was with a quiet, certain devotion. It was the first time they had made love. Everything before had been something else. This was peace. The world, however, always circles back. The following year, the town of Carbon changed. Hatcher, the cowardly sheriff, was gone, replaced by a man named Coulter. Coulter was not a town man. He was a company man. Hired by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, The cattle barons were expanding, pushing out the small ranchers, grabbing land and water rights. Eli's Canyon, with its deep grass and year-round creek, was a prize. Coulter rode up one morning, not alone. He had 3 deputies, all wearing new, matching pistols. "McRae," Coulter said, not dismounting. He was a thin, cold-eyed man. "I have a notice. This land is being quarantined. Texas fever. We're seizing your stock and annexing this canyon for the association's herd." Eli stood on his porch. He was not the same man Coulter had heard about. He was not a hermit. Clara was in the doorway. Beth, now 13 and tall, watched from the window, her hand on the rifle Eli had taught her to use. "There's no fever on my land, Coulter," Eli said, his voice calm. "My report says there is." "This ain't a discussion. It's an order." "This is a land grab," Eli said. "And you're their hired dog. You know it. I know it. Last warning. Cripple, move aside." Eli did not move. "I know my property line. Get off it." Coulter stared at him. He saw the man, the woman, the girl. He saw the well-kept cabin, the greenhouse. This was not some broken hermit he could run off. This was a home. To burn it would be a fight, a real fight, and the association did not want that kind of attention. He spat in the dust. "This ain't over." He and his men rode away. The threat did not die, but it hung back, and the story spread. The hermit with the wooden leg, the one who had stared down Hatcher, was now staring down the association. He was not alone. He had a family. His ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, became a symbol of resistance. Other small ranchers, settlers, and misfits who were being squeezed by the barons saw Eli's stand. They began to stop by, not for shelter, but for trade. They offered to pasture their cattle near his, confusing the quarantine line. They shared information. Eli McRae's ranch had drawn a line in the dirt that the rich and powerful could not, for now, cross. Years passed. Beth grew into a young woman, her eyes holding her mother's light, her hands holding Eli's strength. The cabin grew. Eli, with the help of a few neighbors, added 2 new rooms. One day, on a trip to Laramie for supplies, Clara and Eli passed the church. The minister was standing on the steps, arguing with a town official. Huddled by the door were 2 small children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 6. They were filthy, terrified, and alone. Their parents were freighters, the minister explained. Seeing Clara's look, "Their wagon was lost in the Laramie River. There's no one. The county orphanage is full." Clara looked at the children. She saw herself, evicted and alone. She saw Beth, alone in the laundry. Eli looked at the small boy, who was watching his wooden leg with a silent, serious awe. He saw Jacob, but the image no longer brought a flash of fire. It brought only a dull, hollow ache. He stepped forward, his limp heavy on the wooden steps. He held his large, calloused hand out to the boy. "We've got room," he said. Their home was full. It was loud. It was no longer a silent cabin, but a rambling, noisy, busy ranch house. Beth was the older sister, teaching the 2 orphans, whose names were Samuel and Rose, how to feed the chickens and stack wood. The sound of children's laughter, a sound Eli had thought was gone from his life forever, now echoed in the canyon. One night, years later, a deep winter snow fell, blanketing the ranch in silence. The 3 children were asleep in their beds. Beth, now a young woman of 19, was reading a book by the fire. Eli sat at the table, rubbing oil into the leather straps of the leg brace Clara had made him so long ago. It was still strong. Clara sat in her rocking chair, the firelight on her face. Her hair was threaded with gray. Her hands, calloused but nimble, were stitching. She was finishing a quilt. It was a map of their lives, a square from her old, torn calico dress, a square from Eli's blue flannel shirt, a gray, Rough square from Beth's laundry uniform, a bright red patch from Rose's first Christmas dress, a strip of blue denim from Samuel's overalls. She stitched the last line of thread in the bottom corner. It was not a name or a date, just 3 small, simple words. Eli looked up from his work, the comfortable silence of the room settling around them. "You're finished," he said. She nodded. He limped over and stood behind her chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. He looked down at the quilt, at the patchwork of their hard-won life. He saw the small, neat black embroidery. "We made it fit," he read aloud, his voice low. Clara leaned her head back, resting it against his chest. He looked into the fire, his wife in his arms, his family asleep, and felt the profound, unshakable peace of a life that had been broken in every way and had been made whole. Thank you for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West. We'd love to hear from you. Please comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Your thoughts mean so much to us, so share them in English in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this one.